again and welcome to Looking at Social Justice. I'm Jim Grant, the Director of Social Justice Ministry here in the Diocese of Fresno, and it's my pleasure very often to meet people who are doing outstanding things, and it lets me know more about them and about these projects that they are leading. Today we have a very special guest. Sandra Celedon-Castro is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Fresno Building Healthy Communities, which is another program. We'll talk about all the work of that organization. But she's also leading the charge as Field Director for Fresno for Parks, Measure P. That makes this program super urgent because it's all about an election. It's all about a ballot. It's all about voting in favor of parks for Fresno. And we're going to learn in this program, which we hope will be posted right away, so that many people will see and hear why it is that Fresno needs better parks, more parks, and that it is this group that is going to lead us to having them. They have been in charge of the effort to get it on the ballot. They've been the ones in charge of telling us how they're going to administer the funds once the money is achieved because of our voting for it. So Sandra, thanks for being here today on Looking at Social Justice. Tell us something as we begin about building healthy communities, which is where you really spend the lion's part of your time when you're not leading the charge on P.
Yeah, so Fresno Building Healthy Communities, we're actually a coalition of about 30 community-based organizations primarily working in Fresno and South Fresno, just working together to make sure that we're bringing resources and creating opportunities for all families and children to live healthy, safe, and productive lives. And one of those areas that we have really focused on in the last 5 years is parks. We know that parks are a good thing, that quality parks provide folks with an opportunity to be healthy, to experience joy, to be outdoors, to meet their neighbors. And so we've been leading this charge to ensure that Fresno has quality parks through Fresno Building Healthy Communities. And thanks to our work, we've been able to build this broader coalition, Fresno for Parks, which has helped put Measure P on the ballot this November.
If you could tell us right now, in the first of the 5 major questions that we're going to give you time to really unpack for us, explain to us just Measure P, what it really is as we go into the ballot. What are we going to be looking at?
Well, Measure P is really about creating clean, safe neighborhood parks in every neighborhood in the city of Fresno. It's really a culmination of the last 5 years of work, but even beyond that, it's really the last 30 years. So what we know is that in Fresno, 8 out of 10 parks are in complete disarray. That means they don't have functioning restrooms, the playground lots are unsafe for our children to use, they're not adequately maintained, there's no irrigation, there's dead grass, no programming. And Measure P is really about making sure that we have local funding to improve our neighborhood parks. So the vast majority of the funds that we're proposing with this sales tax initiative, so it will increase sales tax by 3/8 of a cent. That means that an average household of 4 will pay about $3.25 a month, assuming that you purchase, everyday things, excluding groceries, excluding medication. So what I always tell folks is, if you enjoy buying a cup of coffee, if you just not buy that cup of coffee for one day, you will have already made your contribution to make sure that all children in our community have clean, safe parks. So Measure P is about, 1, maintaining and bringing up to our parks to current health and safety standards. That's the lion's share of the measure. It's about creating parks in communities that currently do not have access to parks. We know that in South Fresno, south of Shaw, there's only 1 acre of park space for every 1,000 residents, compared to nearly 5 acres in North Fresno, north of Shaw. So it's really about bringing equity in park space to ensure that all community members have access to parks. It's also about adding trails. It's about adding about 80 miles worth of trails throughout our city to provide connectivity from our parks to our schools to our community centers and really all along our community. Trails are a great place for folks to engage in physical activity, to bike, and used as transportation corridors, right? A lot of folks use their bike to get to and from work, school, and run other errands. And it's also about maintaining the San Joaquin River Parkway. We know that there's a huge need, and this is a huge asset in our community, but we just don't have enough money to maintain the parkway. So we want to make sure that there's enough funding to maintain the trail network along the river, and then there's trails to connect us to the river. It's also about providing programming. We know that there's just not enough programming in our community for children and for seniors. There is not one dedicated senior center in our entire city. That's a shame. Measure P is about making sure that there's resources and funding available to provide a senior center, to provide community centers, and to provide recreational opportunities for children, seniors, and everyone in between. And it's also about beautifying our community. It's about making sure that our major corridors, Blackstone, Shaw, Kings Canyon, our freeways are adequately maintained, that they're not gray or brown anymore, that we're picking up litter along these major corridors so that we experience a source of pride in our community. We know that Fresnans deserve to live in a community that they care about, that brings them joy and brings them pride. And we're only going to do that by making sure that we have enough local funding that stays local, that is focused on making sure that we have all of the amenities of any great city. And it starts with parks.
Fresno B, I must admit, has been a really good advocate for this. And the second question is going to be to have you unpack this excellent article by Brianna Calix saying there's a tremendous history to this. You've outlined it briefly a little, but there's really a lot of detail that you gave in your interview with Brianna over just what is the effort of advocates for this, an uphill battle. But then there's been certain advocates like the two mayors, Alan Autry and Ashley Swearingen, have actually helped in your effort. Can you bring us up to date on that long haul of working towards forming this coalition and getting this on the ballot? Because that's a giant work that you've been involved in.
Yes, and you know, Jim, it really started with young people. And so when, about 5 years ago, Fresno Building Healthy Communities, our coalition, we were doing a lot of work around the general plan, which is the blueprint in our community for how the city will grow in the next 20 to 30 years, right? It's really about thinking through where are we going to put housing, where are we going to build commercial corridors, where are we going to build parks, how are we going to do that? And so as we were working in the general plan, one of the things that we do at Fresno Building Healthy Communities is we're constantly partnering with community residents, and that includes young people. And so we were sharing the work of the general plan, we were gathering ideas, gathering feedback to make sure that we were advocating for the right things. And one of the things that came up very early on, and this was actually with a group of 13 and 14-year-olds, middle schoolers that we were working with at the time. And these young people said to us, very simple question, and they said, why aren't you talking about parks? And we said, well, what do you mean about parks? And these young people shared with us, well, there's no parks near our home, so we're not allowed to go outside because we don't have anything nearby. We have to take 3 buses to get to the nearest park. Or they would say things to us like, the park that is near my house is not safe. The bathrooms are not open. There's no lighting. There's no recreational programming. There's just activity that my parents don't want us to be near. So we don't get to go to the park or have our siblings go to the park. And so we said, tell us more about that. And so it really started our conversation around parks. And so what we said to these young people, we said, we want to hear more about parks. And we asked them to join our coalition, and we asked them if they would be willing to talk to other young people. We said, we want to see if other young people agree with what you're telling us. And so these young people took it upon themselves to conduct a very short survey with 350 of their peers at local parks, at their school, and we helped quantify the results. And what we heard loud and clear through this survey was that young people were seeing the same things across the city. They understood that our parks were not adequately maintained. They were experiencing the fact that there was hardly any activities available to them. And there was one other thing that really stood out for us is young people said, we want to be able to work in our parks. We want job opportunities. We want to be the recreational leads. We want to provide the maintenance, and we want to do all of these things that make our parks great. We're not just asking for a handout. We want to be part of the solution, and at the same time, we want to be able to have these job opportunities. And so we heard that loud and clear, and that was really the spark that ignited our work. And so as advocates, as community-based organizations, we really wanted to respond to the needs and the call of these young people who wanted to be invested in. That's ultimately what they were telling us. And so we launched our advocacy efforts through the general plan, and as we conducted more research, one of the things that we uncovered was the fact that the city of Fresno had not updated the Parks Master Plan in 30 years. I'm 33 years old. That means the city of Fresno had not looked at parks
you were born.
Since I was born.
Let me just say two things about two items you just mentioned, youth and the general plan. Well, one thing that we all need to be doing more, and that would be, let's say, people in church work, people in faith-based work, find out what youth are interested in. Because the idea of wondering what do seniors before they die want to see before they die, why don't you ask young people what do they want to spend their life enjoying? So you did the right thing. You made them your leaders, which very few of us ever do, is ask younger people to lead us. Then this general plan. We did a program on the county's general plan and found out how the whole county needs to be much more sensitive to faithfully filling out what is the general plan. Now we're hearing the city itself had a plan, and you're already finding they are not funding generously, doing diligently what is the plan itself. It's
Right.
calling us. Where did you most find it negligent, Sandra?
Well, you know, it was just negligence all around, right? And this is really where it comes down to the fact that our city leaders made promises to young people, to community members 30 years ago that they never intended to fulfill, right? So they adopted this Parks Master Plan 30 years ago, and then they put it on a shelf and never looked at it again. So when we uncovered this through our work, we really wanted to make sure that we brought that plan back up to current status. And so we really focused on making sure that the Parks Master Plan, right, which was a offshoot of the general plan, was updated. And that was our next advocacy frontier. And so we worked very diligently at the city to make sure that funding was allocated to update the Parks Master Plan. And we were successful. And it was thanks to the same young people who have now been with us since they were 13. So now we have 17, 18, and 19-year-olds that are still in this work, that are seeing the results of their call to action. And so what happened with the Parks Master Plan is that it told us what we all already know, right? That 80% of our parks are considered to be in very poor status,
Yep.
to the point where they're not even usable. That we know we have a huge need for capital improvements, right? To make sure that our facilities are not falling apart, that there's working restrooms, that there's adequate lighting, and that we have a huge deficit in recreational programming across the board. And so what we knew also is that there is just not enough funding at the city through the city general fund to be able to meet these needs. And that's because we know that the vast majority, 70% of the general fund is already allocated to safety, right, to police and fire. So we knew that there just wasn't enough wiggle room in the general fund, right? Only 4 cents out of every dollar currently in our city is allocated to parks. And so we then launched our next frontier of our advocacy, and we said we really need to take a look at how do we actually fund this huge gap? What is it that we need to do?
And how did you come up with that decision that if it's 3/8 of a cent, that over 30 years, it could create $38 million? And how did that come? You got some very important people in town
Yes.
to join this coalition with the young people leading?
Right. So this is where, the next stage of our campaign, we said we really need to figure out some numbers here. So we reached out to the Trust for Public Land, which is a national organization, and they publish an annual park score. So they look at the largest 100 cities across the country, and they give a score based on how well the city is doing at providing quality park space to their constituents, to their residents. And so what we knew at the time is that Fresno, time and time again, has been at the bottom of that list. So we reached out to the Trust for Public Land. We invited them to come to Fresno, and we talked to them about the work that had already been going on, and we talked to them about conducting what is called a feasibility study. We wanted them, because they have the resources and the expertise, to tell us how would we be able, what are the avenues to raise the dollars. So what we know is that currently we need an additional $5 million a year for our Parks Department just to maintain what we have at current status. That means not improving it, that means preventing it from getting worse. That's just $5 million. That's all, $5 million a year additional. We know that. There's $220 million of deferred maintenance. That means we need $220 million to bring up all of our current parks to health and safety standards. That's not adding any new land, right? So we knew all of these things, so we needed the Trust for Public Land to come in and help us. But the Trust for Public Land could only do this feasibility study if city officials, administration would request this of them. So this is when we sent them to meet with then Mayor Ashley Swearingen, and we said, and they were very great at conducting a poll, because we wanted to know, would people pay more for parks? Is it that much of a priority? Because we knew at that time, by then, that yes, parks were important to young people, parks were important to adults. Parks are important overall to every community member. And that's because parks provide all of us with different opportunities, whether it's an opportunity to unwind, right? Whether it's an opportunity to interact with our neighbors, engage in physical activity, provide a space to conduct family gatherings. Parks provide all of these things for different folks, for all of us. So we knew people valued parks, but we wanted to know, do we value them enough to pay a little extra? So Fresno BHC, we conducted an initial poll where we just asked the question if people would be willing to pay more for parks. And the resounding answer was yes. So then we said, well, how would people pay more for parks? Would it be a property tax, a sales tax? Would it be an additional entrance fee? What are the options? And so this is where the Trust for Public Land went to then Mayor Ashley Swearingen, showed her the polling that we had conducted at that point, talked about the work that was going on with the broader table, and that included the San Joaquin River Parkway, Tree Fresno, Communities for a New California, Leadership Council, Fresno Building Healthy Communities, the League of Women Voters, all of these different groups that are really invested in making sure our community is a place where we can all thrive. And so Ashley at that time recognized the importance, recognized the numbers in polling, and said, yes, go ahead and conduct the feasibility study. And so the Trust for Public Land did what they do, and they conducted this feasibility study where they presented to the city and said, if you were to conduct a sales tax based on receipts of the previous years, here's how much we anticipate you would generate if it was a 3/8 of a cent, a 1/4 cent, 1/2 cent, all of these different amounts. If you did a property tax, then this is what we project. So once we knew, okay, how do we make sure that we're not providing an additional burden to families, but we're also meeting the needs of the Parks Master Plan and community members. And so we then engaged in a year-long conversation with hundreds of community leaders that included Ashley Swearingen at that time. When we first approached her, it was in November of her last year in office. And so she then transferred over to the Community Regional Foundation. So she continued to be engaged through her new job assignment. But at that time, we also engaged others, right? A broad coalition of community members to really share all of the work that had been conducted, the conversation that we were having, and recognizing that we hadn't made a decision and we didn't know yet. We wanted to make sure that at every step of the way, we were also talking to community members, to young people, and hearing back from their feedback and really listening to their leadership. And so after, this year-long conversation, we got to the point where we said we believe a sales tax is the right approach. One, because it will allow us to generate enough funding in a longer time span, so it doesn't have to be a huge burden, right, at one time. And we also recognize that this is the way that everyone contributes, right? We know that our parks are available not just to community members that live in the city of Fresno, but also others that come to the city of Fresno. So it's really about making sure everyone pays their fair share. And so we said, okay, well, how much would it cost the average Fresnan? Because we want to make sure we're not contributing to, an excessive amount. This is when we settled on 3/8 of a cent. We said 3/8 of a cent. We anticipate that it's about $3.25 a month, which most community members can afford, right? And even for those of us that are on the lower income scale, it's still, a significant investment, but it's one that we know people are willing to make. Right? And so this is where we arrived. And so we said, okay, so now that we know if we were to conduct a 3/8 of a cent, it would generate about $37 to $38 million a year. So it's not going to do everything that we need to do in the general plan, but what can we do? And so what we know is that it's about the things that people value most. It's about making sure that we upgrade what we currently have, that we maintain it so that it never goes back to the current condition, and that we add slowly more parks, more trails, and make sure that there's recreational opportunities, because we know that this is what young people want. We know, and research shows, that a young person spending just 30 minutes in a park, in green space, improves their ability to succeed in math and science. So we're actually setting them up to be successful just by investing $3.25 a month.
One thing that we should know, there's about 6 more minutes, so I want you to be able to know you've got that much time to help us get right to the point that you wanted to make last points. I wanted to bring up the idea that this makes all the sense in the world to just about anybody that's like impartial and understands that if we want to be a city like other cities, instead of 94th out of 100 with parks, we need to invest in them.
Right.
Do you want to bring up already some of the resistance that there might be and that there is, so that people will be hearing from you why the critique is wrong? It's showing a lack of leadership from the mayor. It's showing a decision that, instead of being like Juan Arambola says, knowing we can do both things at once, we can have parks and we can have safety. Why is it that this city still decides it's either parks my way, with all of the money being divided with law enforcement, instead of agreeing with your very modest approach of taking care of parks first, and don't worry, there will be money later for other concerns? Can you disarm this case?
Absolutely. I think here's a couple of things to remember. If we want to do parks, as you mentioned, my way, from the city's perspective, we've known what they've done the last 30 years. So my way means that we will continue to throw money at something that has not been working. So we can expect another 30 years of worse.
Exactly.
Because if we maintain our if we leave our parks the way they currently are, they're only going to get worse. Now, I want to touch on this issue of safety. Most of us, when we think about safety in our homes, in our community, we're thinking about making sure that we have adequate lighting, right? That our house is not falling apart, right? That we are wearing our seat belts, that we're being preventative. So this concept that safety only means one thing is disingenuous. And I want to say something very clear. I think it's also about greed. We have spent, for the last 10 years, just the last 10 years, we have decimated our parks budget by more than 52%. We have taken 52% of park funding and we have reallocated it to police. That's the reality. Currently, we fund 70%, 70 cents out of every dollar goes to fund our current police and fire departments. And the vast majority of that, 51 cents, goes to police. So this idea that we need to put cops first and that is the only way that we will be safe in our community is disingenuous, and it is about a lack of leadership, and I'll tell you why. So as we were engaging in this broad conversation and bringing on board Mayor Alan Autry, right, Ashley Swearingen, our former superintendent Larry Powell, all of these amazing community leaders that have served in their own capacities, they understood that it is about providing opportunities in our community for folks to feel safe. We feel safe when we are with one another, when we know who our neighbors are, when we know that our kids are safe. And the only way that our children will be safe is if we provide them the opportunity for the things that they have asked us for. Young people have been very clear in our city. They want to be able to have spaces where they feel safe. They want to be able to have opportunities to work. We know that there is no greater investment in a young person than to provide them with outlets to be safe, to be productive, and to feel valued. And that's how young people are going to feel valued in our community. The Measure P also provides small funding sources to create jobs for young people. So it is about making sure that we're providing opportunities for our young people to be invested in their parks. How? By doing the things that they told us they wanted to do, so that they can serve as our recreational leaders, so that they can serve as our facilities assistants, right? So they can help as our irrigation techs. All of the activities that happen in parks, young people have an opportunity with this measure, with the vote of yes on P, they have the opportunity to then come into this park system, contribute to their community, and have a pathway to a career that makes our city great overall. So this concept of it has to be my way is very short-sighted. When you look at who is the opposition, right, I want to make sure that we're very cognizant about that, because this opposition was invited to the table and walked away because we wouldn't give them a blank check. When you look at Measure P, it is written in a way that ensures, one, it is a special tax. That means that it can only be spent on the intended purposes. It is managed by the City of Fresno through the City Parks Department. And so ultimately the city has responsibility, but we've added a Parks Commission. This Parks Commission is a citizen appointed by the mayor that will make sure that the funds are only being spent in the intended ways, that will conduct an annual audit to let the rest of us know how things are progressing on an annual basis. And so it's really about checks and balances. So when we were having this discussion about potentially having a combined measure, what was very clear to us is that there are certain groups in our community that do not like checks and balances, that have gotten used to the last 30 years getting every nickel and dime that comes into our community. And we see what that has resulted. Fresno has some of the highest rates of poverty. We are the lowest of the low when it comes to parks and quality space. Our children are not doing well in terms of education and succeeding. So we have to do something different. We have to set up our community in a way that allows our children and our families to thrive. And although oftentimes we say parks are not the answer, it's actually the opposite. Parks are the answer.
I want to thank you, Sandra, because this has been perhaps the most urgent of the programs that we have produced so far with looking at social justice. It's not only something that's important, it is right now we need to act on it. Please vote in favor of Measure P if you are from Fresno when you vote this November, and let's make our parks the way Sandra and the group that has been formed around her, around building healthy communities, the city we deserve here in Fresno. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.